Actually, he made a point, which I think he was dead right. He said, for you as a manager, Ralph, it's not you that will get you fired. It's not your manager that will get you fired. It's your team that will get you fired.
Welcome all back to the Be Continued podcast. I'm Jess Hilton, co-founder of Be People Group, and I'm here with my fellow founder and co-host Ralph Tribe. We have the pleasure today of welcoming our guest, the brilliant Weronika, the current Chief People Officer at Cyncly. And this episode today is focused on topics like workforce evolution and AI, pay transparency, super important, and performance culture. So, Weronika, thank you so much for being here with us. Super excited to have you in. To start with, for those who don't know who you are, can you give us a little overview of your background and what you do?
Okay, sure. Thank you for having me. It's a great opportunity. Always up for a chat. My name is Weronika Niemczyk-Savage. I work in the space of people, HR. I have a privilege of leading a people team at Cyncly at the moment, and it's a software company, medium-sized business that's in private equity. I've spent most of my career in technology, and I actually started in manufacturing and very quickly moved to technology. I worked for big corporates like Google and Expedia, and then gradually over time moved to smaller companies and also privately owned. So what I do today is help, enable organizations from a people strategy perspective. But as we know, it's changing now. So the role and the definition of that Chief People Officer role is changing. So that's what I do.
And Weronika, just give us a quick sense of the scale of Cyncly and just what it does,
Sure.
where it is, and so on, because it's quite, really quite an interesting business, quite a big business.
Yes.
And when you've talked about it, you go, oh yeah, of course someone has to do that.
Yes.
But it's not immediately obvious. So
Sure.
Tell us about it.
So Cyncly is a very interesting company just because of how, we have been sort of put together. So about 3 years ago, there was a merger of two companies in that space, software development companies that operate in the space of, broadly speaking, interior design. And also manufacturing, but everything around sort of spaces for living as we describe this category. Prior to that merger, both of those businesses have been highly on this sort of path of acquisitions and acquired many smaller companies. So we are effectively very much a sort of blend of all those companies and cultures. From a headcount perspective, we're close to 2,500 employees. Sort of represented across many countries, possibly, all continents, really. Well, maybe not all. Yeah, does that answer?
Yeah, I think so.
Sort of add context?
I reckon.
Really interesting. And I hope that we can kind of circle back to this thread a little bit later, but I want to make sure that we have the time to cover kind of a super topic, which is performance culture. And it's a big one. And I know we've spoken briefly about some of the things that you're doing around this. I just want to kind of jump straight in there because the world is evolving. We're moving into, we've talked about this in other episodes, from what you'd call like a VUCA into a BANI state. So brittle, anxious, non-linear, incomprehensible. And I think there's a question of if our processes and culture are evolving, with all of those external shifts. Can you talk to us a bit about performance culture? So how do you think that it's evolving, performance and engagement, and particularly how it's being measured? Are you seeing a shift there?
It's a big topic, obviously. I mean, I think when we spoke about it, I think I told you that, if people come or, I have questions about performance culture, it's always a bit of a red flag to me, especially when it comes from like the chief exec of the business. Because in a lot of cases, what that means is it's nothing to do with the work that you actually have to put in to have a performance culture. It's really about, can we just fire people that we don't think are doing what we need them to do? And that is a very obviously reductive way of thinking about, culture, performance culture. And I think it has, over the years, got a bit of a bad rap because it's been sort of almost weaponized as that tool to say, oh, we're just going to focus on getting rid of whatever the bottom 10 or, bottom 5, but effectively, not really with any structure, any framework, or any philosophy behind it, right? So I think in my mind, when I think about culture, performance, and actually driving this in a business, which is what we're on that journey at Cyncly, it really starts with actually every colleague understanding what they're accountable for, what is the purpose of their role, and how can they succeed in that role, and what else is in the business that can help them get there. And then it's really through very honest feedback conversations that are not deprioritized, that are not surface level, that actually are there to support people's success rather than penalize or, lead to an exit. And doing this consistently and putting time into that, and then seeing how that translates into whatever are, the broad objectives of the enterprise. But that requires a lot of consistency, a lot of work. It requires manager engagement. It requires people to kind of be open to lean into difficult conversations. So it doesn't always feel great when you do it, but I think at a minimum there is clarity of when you have done something well and when you have perhaps come a bit short. So then it really is about sort of that, that rigor or that consistency, right? It's a little bit like going to the gym. You can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to wake up today and then tomorrow go to the gym and then tomorrow I'm going to be fit. I better wake up fit. It's actually just putting in the work, even if you don't feel like it, but doing that consistently so that, hopefully you kind of get closer to whatever that end result is. But you have to be checking in your progress on that journey, right? And somebody has to tell you like, oh, are you getting closer to your goal or you're not? So that's what I, think is the culture of performance. And I think in that construct, you also treat your employees as adults. So you kind of share with them, here's what I think, here's what you're responsible for very broadly. Here's what I think you're doing today that is absolutely brilliant. Here's the things that you could do better. Are we in agreement? Yes or no? And then how can I help you to get to the stage when you can do things better? And also, what are the consequences if you don't address the things that are coming short? And then everybody is hopefully clear to understand what those expectations are. And they can then also reassess and say, hey, you know what? Actually, this doesn't work for me anymore. Yeah. So, or I just don't think I can do what you're asking me to do. But then it's, there is this sort of ingrained accountability for nobody is pretending anything. People have clarity. They can make their own decisions. And they're sort of signing up for this with engagement because they understand how the system operates. There isn't any opaqueness in that sort of philosophy. So, it sounds, I think, pretty straightforward when I describe it, but I think that's where a lot of companies are just not willing to put the work in.
And how do you know if it's working? So do you have a way of, you mentioned the steps of progress, but how do you track it or measure it?
Well, again, I would say not anything super revolutionary. So we do have OKRs that we set for the business that we communicate to everybody. We now actually invested this year, we've invested in a platform that allows us to put those actually into a system. And that allows our colleagues, literally everyone in the organization, to then create their own objectives that are linked to that OKR. So in some ways, it's a process whereby it is a cascaded sort of goal setting system, but also you can have goals that aren't necessarily specifically attached to those bigger company-wide OKRs. Mm-hmm. But it's a sort of, it's a system that allows you to see, I can see my boss's goals. I can also see the company ones. I can see how what I'm doing today hopefully contributes to that. And I think, obviously, again, over time, you get to see how those objectives are tracking. I think one of the indicators from my side, because obviously we sort of administrate that system, is how engaged our colleagues are in actually going into the system and updating their goals. We look at the quality of how those goals are defined. And that tells you a lot, if people kind of just go, oh, I have to put my goals in, so I'm just going to make something up. And then you read it and you're like, well, that makes no sense. Then obviously that, I guess deteriorates the quality of that process. But over time, you see that people are a lot more bought into it, because I think the other thing that, again, you kind of have to attach to this is obviously what are the rewards that are tied to it. And we have changed, in fact, our compensation philosophy, whereby we have a very direct link between individual performance and effectively the salary or the reward that you get from a compensation perspective as a result of that performance rating or that performance review, right? So there is a lot more engagement from the teams. There's also what we've seen this time around is we have opened up an opportunity for peers to give each other feedback. So we didn't have that functionality in our other HR system, but we had 71% of our sort of global colleagues actually submit feedback who were asked for it without us doing any form of sort of HR, engagement on this, because I think people saw the value of actually, I want to understand what I'm doing, what I could be doing better. And I also want my boss to see the feedback that comes from people who work with me. So it becomes a lot more of a sort of, we're doing this as a community type of process.
But that's interesting, isn't it, right? Because that sort of platforms that have allowed people to give each other feedback have been around for a long time,
yes.
right? And they are sort of notorious for being underwhelming. I mean, I've implemented them in the past and been... a bit underwhelmed by what happens without any push, and actually a bit underwhelmed then by what happens if you push in terms of, you might get a momentary kind of uptick in uptake, but, it quite quickly just sort of goes back to not being used. So you've got 71% of people have done it with no push.
Yes.
So why? Like, why has that happened? When, many people listening to this and my own experience and probably your own experience in the past is, we didn't get that good engagement in this before, so what's the difference?
Well, I think because it matters in the sense that there is clear outcomes. If you, again, broadly speaking, if you're performing or you're overperforming, then that will have a material impact on the rewards that you're getting. And the other way, right?
So you have individualised,
yes.
Or individualised bonuses or individualised...
salary increases, like merit increase. To be more specific, if you're performing, you sort of get whatever is that default increase for that country, obviously, where you're based. But if you're significantly overperforming, you get twice that amount.
Okay.
So, I think in a... also world where, again, if you look at sort of the software development space, we're probably talking over the last, 3 years, very little merit increases, very little annual increases, in some cases, probably none. I think that really matters. So, the translation of how you're actually performing in your job, if there's the clearer you can make the link, I think that helps sort of motivate the team because they know that actually this matters. It's not that, my feedback goes into some sort of black box and you just don't know how that's going to translate into anything.
Because I was going to say, systems where if you go X rating, you get Y. I mean, they've been around forever.
Yes, yeah.
So just on the face of it, what you're describing, you're going, okay, well, is that the reason? Because I can remember the systems where we wanted people to give feedback on each other, which didn't work very well. But they were environments where there was some differential in pay increase. Yeah, but it wasn't as much as that. It would be like you might get 3% if you were average and sort of 4% if you were brilliant. Is your point then that it can't just be 4% if you're brilliant? It has to be more than that. That it has to be tangible. What the point of all of this is.
I mean, I think I don't know would be the short answer, right? But I think there is probably some power in saying, if you get 100% at sort of performing, and then, you get, 150 when you're just above that, and then you get 200% of that. I think that does speak to, actually, this is pretty meaningful. Like, that is something for me to go after, right?
Yeah.
But I actually think, that I think sometimes we try things in the people space and then we don't quite sort of leave it long enough, or we don't quite, or we over-engineer it, or we overcomplicate it, and people just lose the ability to understand, like, why does that matter?
Yeah.
And, I think that there are probably, things that, the HR sort of people community, performance reviews, I think, would be one where, we probably got it to the stage at some point where it's just physically impossible to write the reviews or make the form. I've seen certainly forms that are like 10 different questions, and it takes me as a manager like 2 hours to just fill out the form, right? And I think sometimes we kind of, I guess in the HR world, we tend to then overcomplicate the process. And it just becomes it doesn't really inspire actually doing the right thing, which is giving your colleague a feedback.
Yeah.
Because it's just too much work on top of everything else. So
well, you haven't got time. If you've spent 2 hours filling in a form, you haven't got any time to have a conversation with them or ask for feedback.
Exactly,
because in the end,
yes.
time is finite.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree.
But hey, you've got AI now, right? So, which again is super helpful in writing reviews, and actually the system we're using actually allows you to use like AI when you give it prompts and you ask for feedback. And because you see people's objectives in there, it is helpful to kind of summarize like, oh, I can see what that person has achieved. I also get a summary of the peer feedback, so a manager jobs becomes easier. But I think that there is a little bit of, are there simple things that just work? Because the human nature is, if I can understand it, it's a little bit like incentives for salespeople, right? The principle should be really simple. The salesperson should really understand what I'm doing today, my activity, what that translates in terms of my rewards generally. And somehow, when it comes to everyone outside of sales, we just kind of forget about that. We just assume that people will know, or that somehow, they'll have this self-motivation. And obviously, work, ideally, isn't just about rewards. But I think there is so much, value from hearing positive feedback, and constructive, obviously, from your peer group. I think sometimes that matters a lot more than hearing that feedback from your manager.
Yeah.
And I think I sort of guess, or, that some of the feedback that we've seen is that we've never done this before in this business. So again, every company that we've acquired probably had a slightly different system. But because we've done it maybe for the first time, so, ask me the question in a year's time, I think our colleagues just got a lot of, value from just understanding, oh, wow, this is what you think of my work. Or I had no idea that you actually saw that I could do this, or that was something that was important to you.
Yeah, it's the understanding that matters.
Yes.
Isn't it? It's almost more than anything. It's just like understanding. So quite an interesting point that you make about, I wonder if people care more about feedback from their peers than from their manager. That kind of strikes me that could easily be true, right? Because if you go to the science of, well, what are human beings, what are children influenced by? And everyone sort of goes, well, probably their parents most of all. And yet all the research forever has shown us that parental influence is a secondary, if not worse than that influence, after the age of 8. Well, I mean, I think it's about 8. Probably different studies give you, like, it could be 9, it could be 10. And what then replaces it is peer influence. People are much more influenced than at 8 and above by what their peers are saying, what their peers think, and so on and so on. But people probably do overemphasize how much influence a manager's opinion or feedback sort of has relative to peers. I remember I've had managers. We've all had managers in the past. And the absolute sort of reality is that, their feedback, it's kind of interesting and relevant, and sometimes you believed in something. But the thing that was more visceral in terms of what you actually paid attention to was if your peers either liked you or didn't either like your work or didn't like your work. I remember being much more profoundly influenced actually by that in terms of behaviour change and so on than I really was by any sort of singular boss who was kind of giving me feedback.
Yeah. I think also in how our workplace, and our jobs are changing, I think it becomes a lot more relevant. Obviously, what's not going to change is your manager effectively is the person who kind of keeps you, quote unquote, in the job, right? So in some ways, I think, there's always the sense of, I definitely need to make sure my manager is happy with the work that I'm doing. But I think the sense of, almost belonging in a team. I think your kind of broader sense of like meaning or purpose, which we know, has a huge impact on your level of engagement. I think that is really only something that your colleagues can give you. It's almost like it's hard being an island, in a team. A lot of, we talked in the past about this concept of like a brilliant jerk, when companies hire folks who are impossible to collaborate with. but they're really good in their sort of area, in their jobs. And I always thought, why would you want to be that? Why would you reduce your work experience to just sort of, caring about what's right in front of you, where it could be so much better, it could be so much bigger. And I think that what you get from those peer relationships or feedback you get from your peers is almost the side view of, hey, you don't depend on me in general, right? There isn't a sense of dependency between us in that very direct way, which there is in the manager relationship. But I have an opinion about what you do really well, and I can also offer you perspective on what you can consider to perhaps change to improve your success. And I think if you get it to the point where it really comes from a place of this sort of wanting to support the other person, then it's almost, I think creates that sense of community. And arguably, I think that leads to a greater sense of the psychological safety, right? That you have other people that you can trust, that you can rely on, that you can ask for help, that you can ask for advice. And that can work in many different directions. And that source of feedback is not just your manager, because again, how our roles are changing, your manager probably has a very specific and only one-dimensional view of the contribution that you're making in your role. So why would we not look for, hey, actually, I just get a really positive sense about my being here in this company, my contribution, more so from my peers who get to see a lot more of my work than my manager.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree completely. One thing I'm not entirely sure that I agree with is this idea that your manager is the person that keeps you in a job. Because I do remember getting some insight a long time ago, it must have been more than 20 years ago, from a guy that I worked for who was really not very nice, but he did have some amazing insight. In fact, he had two pieces of amazing insight. As far as I was concerned, and one really stuck with me. Actually, he made a point, which I think he was dead right. He said, for you as a manager, Ralph, it's not you that will get you fired. It's not your manager that will get you fired. It's your team that will get you fired or hired. Although by that I think he meant, respected and so on and so on. So, and I think he was absolutely right. I think, particularly if someone's in a managerial position, it's actually the people who matter most in terms of them selfishly staying in their job, thriving in their job and so on. It's not their manager. It's actually their own team.
Yeah, and I suppose it changes, I think, with like seniority and perhaps like how big your role is, right? But I think in my mind, it was more of, in the sort of racy concept, who has the decision is typically your manager, right? So, but yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that's where also I think, those traditional sort of systems for performance that really just depended on the manager's kind of view of your work were just not designed for actually measuring performance and impact. They were just designed to collect managers' opinion about an individual. Yeah.
And maybe the management piece is more linked to, like you said, the financial merit of how you perform, because I had a conversation with a friend recently and he was saying that in their business, they have maybe a slightly more old traditional performance metrics where it is linked to your bonus. And so, but it can feel like from your manager or the business that they never really want to give you 100% of the bonus. So they'll always find some reasons why you are maybe not exceptional as to hold some of it back. So actually maybe the peer review is more trusted feedback because there's no financial link to that. It's just pure feedback. So maybe that's a component of it as well. To kind of conclude this piece, I'm just wondering if you have any advice. And you mentioned things like transparency, not being overly complex, having the kind of link to financial gain for people as well. If there's someone listening and they feel like they're in the trenches with this dark side of performance culture and they think it's an impossible journey, any advice on where to begin with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would really, if somebody came to me and said, I want to build a culture of performance in my, or performance culture in my business, I would start with asking them, define what you mean by that. What is it that you're not getting today that you would want to get? And then I suppose get a bit more curious about, how would they recognize that there is this culture of performance? Because I think everybody, like the definition of it, I think is quite different maybe for some people. And I would literally just start with understand what is the most important thing in your business. Whether it is your customers, then how do you measure, how do you stay focused on that as a business? Start from those, like honestly start from goal setting and then helping people understand how they can contribute to those goals. So I think that really is the very basic start, because that helps sort of attach everybody in the company to what is our purpose in life as a company, right? Like what is the difference that we're making? And I think the clearer that is, the simpler that is. And the more people can articulate, hey, I'm working on these 3 things. This is what I'm focusing on. And I can see how that then helps us be better as a business in however you define that better. I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I agree. And okay, thank you. Another big topic, which we're going to touch on, pay transparency. Mm-hmm. So huge, there's the EU Pay Transparency Directive coming into play next year. Is it June?
Yeah.
Yep.
What do you think, what are the challenges around discussing pay transparency and implementing it at the moment? Are you seeing that? What are you finding?
Yeah, and if I can be slightly maybe controversial for a moment and, speak to the like people sort of HR community, is I hear a lot, in the community, I hear a lot of, this is just, very inconvenient and, it's just such a problem. And why are we doing this? And there's this legislation that comes out and now we all have to do it. And I feel like we're kind of forgetting almost like why is it that we had to have this legislation put in place? And I think the principles behind it are absolutely right. And we shouldn't be arguing with the fact that, there should be equal pay for equal work. I mean, I would be very happy to have a conversation with anyone who feels differently about it. And frankly, don't think, hopefully there would be many people. So that's one side of it. And then there's, I think, a challenge, which is just how do you operationalize it? I think it's a bigger challenge, for some of the HR teams that have, employees in many countries in the EU, where I suppose, every single country that's a member, will have a different interpretation also of that legislation, and there will be different rules. So there is a very kind of real, I guess, operational sort of cost and some lift that needs to happen. And I think the bigger question really is around, hey, well, like we have to have mature conversations with our employees where there is a gap, like why that is the case, and also give them the information and ideally have some good understanding of like how their pay compares to their peer group. Perhaps we need to make, decisions around how we continue sort of operating in those countries. How do we address some of the discrepancies that we see there? And typically, I think people kind of feel uncomfortable having those conversations because they're just not very easy to have. So it's I think the last, in the corporate world, I feel like it is the last sort of, what's the word, like a pillar of secrecy or opaqueness.
Well, it's certainly a big pillar of inequality.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it's
yes.
I mean, some other things are being addressed, I mean, by no means all. But in terms of like one singular big pillar of just like obvious unfairness and inequality,
exactly.
it's this, isn't it? Pay transparency, or the absence of pay transparency.
Exactly, yeah.
Because it just allows a corporation to continue with basically an unfairness or a sort of like the lie of omission. Mm-hmm. For any kind of, for the most part, woman sort of looking at, am I paid fairly for my performance relative to anyone else in this organisation, men. Not going there. It's just like, just persist then organisationally, collude massively organisationally in just not giving people information because it hides an unfair, a fundamental unfairness, a fundamental problem. Yeah.
And that's what I suppose, I think pay generally, right, has been this sort of very opaque, it's all confidential, you can't share any of this detail with, your colleagues. I think the US in some ways, interestingly enough, has been more progressive, because there's obviously been legislation around, when you advertise a job, you actually have to put the salary in there already. Like there are obviously states where you can't ask people for what their compensation is. So it's like, it's kind of coming late, but I think, there's like traditionally, I mean, I obviously grew up in my career in that sense of like, compensation is like the very, very secret, naturally sensitive information. And so maybe there's also this almost, change shift of like, oh, so what, we're supposed to just give it away and we're supposed to just share it. And yes, still it's very sensitive. But I think it goes to the point, but we're really forgetting like why actually even reporting requirements were just not enough, because it kept happening, because reporting just didn't really make any difference, right? So, I would say a lot of times I think it's also like just ignorance, right? That it's, unless you make it somehow require that people pay attention to it, nobody does. So what we continue doing is almost the same thing. We just continue doing what we've done before, because we don't have to necessarily see, if I'm hiring somebody, and it's a woman, like, do I need to compare that salary to, everybody else on that team? Or do I just basically say, hey, here's the budget I've got. This is the salary, you kind of take it or leave it, right? And you and I have, talked about it, I think, over the years. It really all comes down to, can you explain to somebody why a decision has been made?
Yeah.
And again, I think every time I was concerned about having a conversation with somebody, or I would say in 90% of the cases, I was surprised that if you can explain something to the point where it's like, here's the arguments I use to make a decision, and give, the other person some reassurance that actually you thought about it and it wasn't based on, gender or, other circumstances, exactly, or characteristics, that actually they can sort of understand at a minimum, and sometimes agree and be like, right, okay, I can understand it, and I appreciate being treated respectfully and like an adult.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're going to be an advocate for anything, it should be this is one of the top things. Do you think that there's a positive lens on this, whereby people can overcome the kind of the eye roll culture of pay transparency and have it become more of a strategic conversation, by where like people have to do it? But if you're a company who really takes the pay transparency bull by the horns and it becomes part of your brand almost, do you think you'll see a distinction there with, talent attraction, retention? Will it make actually a strategic, it should do, but do you think it actually will make a difference for those businesses?
Yeah, I think it will. Similar to, flexible working, similar to, giving people the ability to work from anywhere. I think those type of policies that I think encourage just are based on more trust and transparency. Just generally, I think differentiate companies, really. And I think, it's especially what's been happening, I guess, since COVID, and almost this, falling out of love with some of the big corporate cultures, where all of a sudden, a lot of people realize that, it is at the end of the day a bit transactional. I think companies who can build that sort of trust, but again, not based on, we're just going to tell you a pretty story about, what it means to work here, but actually we will, make sure that you have a great experience here, and we will be very open, and so you can make the right decision for yourself. I think that becomes a huge differentiator. And also for, we touched a little bit on this in the context of engagement, sort of this discretionary effort. In the PE world in particular, where you're scaling the business and you have to be very sort of cost conscious, and you have to be very mindful of how quickly you can scale in a way that is responsible. We rely on that discretionary, effort from our colleagues. And so I think the more we can do to kind of allow people to, apply themselves in those roles again, by giving them clarity, but also just being honest and transparent, I think those things do really matter.
I forgot to ask you a question earlier, and I should have asked it in kind of when we were discussing performance, but I think it's a standalone topic anyway, and actually plays into employee retention. Psychological safety. So can you tell us, what is psychological, or you can just cut this in and paste it where the where the performance culture topic was. Can you tell us what is psychological safety and why do you think it's essential to a high performance culture?
So, psychological safety, I think, was a term that was sort of coined, with as an outcome of Project Aristotle, I think, that Google ran a number of years ago, which was around, how do you get the most out of a team? Mm-hmm. One of those sort of factors, obviously, they've studied a lot of teams at the time, and they realized that one of the key components of it is the psychological safety. And in that definition, if people kind of, bother to go back and actually read, you can Google this project, and there's a ton of research that obviously has been produced off of the back of it. It actually comes down to feeling like you can make mistakes and that you won't be penalized for making those mistakes, because mistakes are essentially part of the learning process. And that, that sort of sense of, I don't have to hide my mistakes. I'm not wasting time as a team member in like covering up, if I made an error, and actually I am sharing this because we can all benefit from learning from one another. I think that was sort of at the very core, the definition of psychological safety. Now, I think recently, because of what's been happening in the world, and because of, obviously huge layoffs that were happening in tech, I think that sort of term got almost reduced to, well, this is just about me knowing I'm not going to get fired. And I think it is really, it's really hard, because in reality of any business today, I think it's just impossible to say, oh, we're never going to let anybody go. Like, nobody can make those promises. And I would say if they do, that's where I would be asking questions of like, why are you saying something that you just can't guarantee? And I personally feel it is quite disrespectful, again, telling adults, oh, we're never going to let anybody go, where it's like, you don't have the influence, in your business to the extent, I don't know, unless you run a little shop somewhere and you have, 2 employees, and
but you still can't say
yeah, exactly. Right. I'm just trying to think about, is there a, but in today's reality, like, that is just not the case. And, frankly, years ago, when people had the experience of being laid off, it was almost like this, they were marked, and it was very, everybody would look at them and like, oh, it would be difficult for you to find another job. It's very different today. Like, most people would have that experience of losing a job, not because of anything that they've done, but because the business strategy has changed. Hey, AI, came, like, whatever it is, whatever those sort of business circumstances are. And it's changing a lot quicker. Those cycles of change are now much faster. So it really wouldn't be fair for anyone to say, I can guarantee that you will, whatever happens, like, you're never going to lose your job. This is why also, the concept of talking about the business as a family is a bit misleading, because it's not. It's a group of, it's a group of people that sort of work for a period of time together towards a common goal. But those people will probably come in and out and change, because the goal will slightly evolve.
And do you know what I find this interesting is, because from my perspective, what you're seeing, not just now, recently, in recent years, but more so now with more AI, you used to have companies wanting this, and bear with me because it does relate to your point. You used to have companies really wanting that kind of steady state profile, that kind of steady Eddie CV, 20 years steady state. And I don't think that's as valuable anymore as a candidate who has various different experiences to offer, because it's moved away from kind of that, okay, we need X years experience in someone who knows how to get from someone who has experience getting from A to B and knows how they got there. And now it's much more about planning strategy or making a path from A when B doesn't necessarily even exist. So to your point on this, if you are building a culture where you can't fail or take risks or speak out without fear of some sort of retribution, how can you even consider being successful as a company?
Because the reality is failure is absolutely inevitable in the sort of the modern world. I was given a fact by a man who I believe actually probably is the world's expert on Teams, called Mark Durand. I worked with him at Sky and at Essential, but he had a great sort of indicator on psychological safety, which completely talks to the stuff at Google. But it was a similar piece of research. It was done in the health service, and it looked at hospitals that had the best outcomes in terms of best overall health outcomes for the sort of the population that they served, and those that had the least bad. Those that had the best strategic outcomes were the ones that reported most mistakes. And those that had the worst overall outcomes as hospitals were those that reported the least mistakes. And it was kind of an interesting study, because it was like, the ones that have the most accidents and mistakes, they're the best. And it's like, yeah, because the hospitals that are reporting so few, they absolutely still have them. They're just not reporting them, and no one's learning anything from them. So they're just sort of carrying on along the same path with all the same problems occurring. Those that were open and where the sort of the teams felt that they had the sort of the psychological safety, which would allow them to sort of say, even on something important as health, and critical issues like this, we made some errors, we had some accidents, we had some. They were the ones that learned, and inevitably, as we all know, they're the ones that get the best outcomes. So, yeah, it's a funny thing, psychological safety.
Yeah, it is, and I think the point that you were making, Jess, as well. I think there's definitely, I think, learning, and again, an understanding of like, how do you get to have, that team where there is more, there's actually a mix of folks who have that sort of, steady career, and how do you make sure that there's space for them? Because I think that is also, sometimes I think, especially in like startups, and scale ups, I think there's a tendency to sort of ignore that and say, we can figure everything out. Well, not always, I think there is definitely a tremendous depth in having folks in the business who have seen the company going through those different stages, who actually have deep relationships with their customers, who truly understand, the sort of the tenets of how the business was built. And I think at the same time, you need folks who have that very diverse experience and have seen different businesses at different stages. And I think finding that right sort of mix is probably the best recipe. Now, having said that, from an individual perspective, I think we used to over-index, or people would use this, especially managers, I think, would use this phrase of like, I appreciate loyalty. And I'm just like, well, tell me, what are you, what does that mean today? People should, by all means, do what is right for the business and what is right for them as individuals and for their careers. And a company owes them a great work experience. You shouldn't be expecting anybody to be loyal to you. You need to make it worthy their time and their effort. And I think that's sometimes, this little bit of like a whiff of the past of like, I'm looking for loyalty. No, you if you want performance, like loyalty is not, you need to be loyal to your employees and make sure that they know how to be successful here, but they kind of owe you really nothing other than their best effort. You know?
Totally agree with you. And on the piece about both types of profiles being super, super valuable as well. I think, unfortunately, there's so much more that I would love to speak with you about, and there's things we never got to go through, like in terms of AI reskilling, role hybridization, and a lot of like great stuff I know we've spoken about before. I just want to say thank you to Weronika and Ralph. I think this has been a really, really great discussion. I wish we had more time to go through more topics together. Maybe we will at some point in the future. Let's see. But I hope it's been a great episode for the listeners, and do join us next time for when the conversation is to be continued. Thank you so much.